The history of mankind is carried on the back of a horse. Hello and welcome back to What's Past is Prologue. This is the channel where we talk about the story of civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. In the last video we looked at the domestication of animals, but I deliberately didn't talk very much about horses. And that was because when I was writing notes for that video, I realized that Durant talks about horses way more than he talks about any other animal. In fact, there are more than 700 references to the horse during the course of the 11 volumes. And so what I thought I would do is make a separate video dedicated to horses, or dedicated to Durant's writing on horses, their role in art, their role in history. Here's Durant in Volume 1 on animals in prehistoric cave art. This is what he says. Most often, the subjects of these drawings are animals: reindeer, mammoths, horses, boars, bears, etc. These presumably were dietetic luxuries, and therefore favourite objects of the chase. Sometimes the animals are transfixed with arrows. These, in the view of Fraser and Reinach, were intended as magic images that would bring the animal under the power, and into the stomach, of the artist or the hunter. Conceivably, they were just plain art, drawn with the pure joy of aesthetic creation. The crudest representation should have sufficed for the purposes of magic, whereas these paintings are often of such delicacy, power, and skill as to suggest the unhappy thought that art, in this field at least, has not advanced much in the long course of human history. Here is life, action, nobility, conveyed overwhelmingly with one brave line or two. Here, a single stroke, or is it that others have faded, creates a living, charging beast. Will Leonardo's Last Supper or El Greco's Assumption bear up as well as these Cro-Magnon paintings after 20,000 years? And to unnecessarily answer what is obviously a rhetorical question here from Durant, the answer of course is no, particularly in the case of the Last Supper, which has lost lots of its vibrancy over the last 500 years. If you look at the reds and the blues of Christ's robes, it's clear that they're not nearly as vivid as they would have been when that painting was first created. Regardless, the focus of this video is actually on horses, and so when Durant wrote this first volume, the information that he had available to him with regards to cave painting came primarily from the discovery of the cave at Altamira, which is in the province of Cantabria, which is in northern Spain on the Bay of Biscay. Now, Altamira was originally discovered in 1868, but it wasn't until 1879 that people realized that on the ceiling of this cave were all these different paintings of animals. Originally, these paintings were considered to likely be a hoax. It wasn't until other cave paintings were also discovered in different caves, particularly those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, that people began to take the idea of prehistoric cave painting seriously and began to believe that it was genuine. The caves at Lascaux and Chauvet were discovered in 1940 and 1994, respectively. They both have far more prehistoric horse imagery in them. It's unfortunate, really, because had Durant published this volume 10 years later, he almost certainly would have included a whole bunch of information about Lascaux, but archaeology dates us all. The art at Lascaux goes back to 15,000 BC, whereas the paintings at Chauvet go back all the way to 30,000 BC. As you can see, the walls are covered in horse imagery. Great interest was taken in detailing the horse's anatomy. The artists of these cave paintings, and we should call them artists because that's clearly what they were, spent a lot of time thinking about and considering the animal. The contours of the cave are used to create depth in the image. Certain anatomical features are emphasized using the shape of the cave. This suggests that the artists were premeditated. They knew what they were going to paint before they started painting. Perspective is used to create a three-dimensional quality. This is particularly emphasized in torchlight. The flickering of flames would have created a sense of movement in these figures. The shape of the horses in these images have led some people to suggest that it might be the ancestor of the Przewalski horse. Now, the Przewalski horse is a wild horse that lives in Mongolia. It's been debated recently whether or not the Przewalski horse is actually a wild horse, or whether it is rather a feral horse that has been descended from a once domesticated breed. What we can say for certain is that the horses depicted in these caves certainly would have been wild animals. It would be another 100 centuries after we had painted the caves at Lascaux before we even began to think about the domestication of horses. And at this point, we would almost certainly have been hunting horses for use as food. There's lots of things that we don't know for sure. Why did our ancestors even choose to paint on these cave walls in the first place? This remains unclear. Intriguingly, we know that they didn't really depict human beings very often, and when they did depict human beings, it was always in the form of stick figures. This is interesting because we know that when they wanted to, they could depict all kinds of animals in realistic shapes and forms, but they always chose to depict human beings in an unrealistic way. Why? It's possible that horses held some religious or spiritual significance for these people. Do other animals have an aesthetic sense? Perhaps, but in human beings it's highly developed. Did our ancestors paint purely for aesthetic pleasure? Clearly, even 30,000 years ago, mankind appreciated both beauty and grace. When thinking about prehistoric art, it's important to keep in mind the possibility of preservation bias. Our author talks about this in the volume. He says this: "The whole interpretation of history as progress falters when we consider that these statues, bas-reliefs, and paintings, numerous though they are, may have been but an infinitesimal fraction of the art that expressed or adorned the life of primeval man. What remains is found in caves, where the elements were in some measure kept at bay. It does not follow that prehistoric men were artists only when they were in caves. They may have carved as sedulously and ubiquitously as the Japanese. They may have fashioned statuary as abundantly as the Greeks. They may have painted not only the rocks in their caverns, but textiles, wood, everything, not excepting themselves. They may have created masterpieces far superior than the fragments that survive." Equus ferus caballus, or the modern horse, can be traced back some 4 million years. Its earlier evolutionary ancestry, though, can be traced back up to 50 million years, originating in North America. Equine history, like most mammals, only became possible after an asteroid impact some 66 million years ago. Mammalian diversity required the mass death of the Yucatan. Life is not sentimental. Around 2.5 million years ago, during the early Pleistocene, horses crossed the Beringian land bridge from Alaska to Siberia, and it's most fortunate for human civilization that they did. If they'd not crossed over into the Old World, then they would very likely have disappeared altogether, and all of modern civilization as we know it would never have been possible. By 8000 BC, the horse was extinct where it had originated in North America. This is either due to climate change or hunting or some combination of both. The horse would not appear again in the Americas until it was brought over by Columbus, and later the conquistadors. Strangely, horses, a species so heavily associated with the Native Americans, was both long forgotten by and in fact unknown to the Native Americans for most of their history. Our collective history is so old that most of it is long forgotten. So what became of the equus who spread to the Old World? The species continued to adapt to its environment and diversify. Examples of equus diversification include species like the donkey and the zebra, who are both closely related to the horse. They continued to be hunted for food, but intriguingly not to the point of extinction. Perhaps the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe saved the horse. Perhaps it was luck. In the last video, I talked about how the domestication of animals can often save a species from extinction. Perhaps that was the case here with the horse. Would the horse have survived in the Old World if its domestication wasn't so useful for humanity? The domestication of the horse took place around 3000 BC, somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, probably east of the Don, certainly east of the Dnieper River, likely in eastern Ukraine or southern Russia. The horse was first domesticated for use as food and for its milk. Later, it was harnessed for its use in warfare, for work as beast of burden, and then for travel, trade, and sport. Here is our author now on when horses first arrived in recorded history. I think he wants to speak in front of the microphone. The horse is first mentioned in Babylonian records around 2100 BC as the ass from the east. Apparently, it came from the tablelands of Central Asia, conquered Babylonia with the Kassites, and reached Egypt with the Hyksos. Other early equids arrived in Africa around 4.5 million years ago, but as Durant says, the modern domesticated horse arrived first in Egypt with the Hyksos. There is still much debate about the Hyksos, but what we can say is this. By the end of the 14th dynasty, in around 1650 BC, the Egyptians were in trouble. They were internally split, trade was in decline, and famine had left the Egyptian state weak. And then the Hyksos arrived. Whether the Hyksos arrived all at once or whether it was gradual remains unclear. But they took control of the Delta and Lower Egypt and ruled for around 100 years. They never got to Thebes or Upper Egypt, which is in the south. But these outsider pharaohs ruled only part of the country, but they constitute the 15th dynasty. This is considered to be part of Egypt's second intermediate period. We'll look at the Hyksos in much greater detail when we get to Egypt later in the first volume. But for our purposes here, though, one of the key factors in Hyksos ascendancy is the arrival of the horse and the war chariot. The horse represented a new military technology that gave the Hyksos an advantage in both speed and mobility. It was this, among other advantages, that allowed the Hyksos to take control of Lower Egypt and the Delta. We also know that the arrival of the horse in Egypt had a strong impact on the psychology of Egyptian society. After the second intermediate period, horses began to be represented strongly in Egyptian art. The horse and the war chariot provided military advantages for sure, but the arrival of the horse in human civilization also sped up communications. For the next 5,000 years, riders on horseback were the fastest way people could travel. The expansion of the vast Achaemenid Empire also created a demand for information to travel quickly. Kings needed to put down revolts or send aid to different regions of the empire, and this required rapid communications. The Achaemenid Empire stretched all the way from the Indus Valley in the east to Cyrenaica in the west, and comprised some 5.5 million square kilometers. It was this empire that pioneered road building and a postal service, where post could be sent by riders on horseback. Durant writes in this first volume about how efficient this postal service was, even in 500 BC. He says this: "Engineers, under the instructions of Darius I, built great roads uniting the various capitals. One of these highways, from Susa to Sardis, was 1,500 miles long. The roads were accurately measured by parasangs, 3.4 miles, and at every fourth parasang, says Herodotus, there are royal stations and excellent inns, and the whole road is through an inhabited and safe country. At each station a fresh relay of horses stood ready to carry on the mail, so that, though the ordinary traveller required 90 days to go from Susa to Sardis, the royal mail moved over the distance as quickly as an automobile party does now, that is, in less than a week. It was the domestication of horses that allowed this Achaemenid postal system to carry information so quickly. Such was the fame of this system that the Romans later adopted it, and Durant writes about this, and he says this: "The public post, by carriage or horse, at all hours, averaged 100 miles a day. Augustus had modelled it on the Persian system as indispensable to imperial administration. It was called cusus publicus, as serving the res publica, or commonwealth, by carrying official correspondence." The domestication of the horse sped up communications, but it also inspired the imaginations of storytellers. Greek mythology is replete with equine imagery. All the world knows the story of the Trojan horse, but let's take the less well-known story of the centaur. The Lapiths, in Greek legend, were a mountain tribe of Thessaly. When Pirithous, their king, married Hippodamia, daughter of King Ennomaus of Pisa in Elis, he invited the centaurs to the wedding feast. The centaurs dwelt in the mountains about Pelion. Greek art represented them as half man and half horse, possibly to suggest their untamed woodland nature, or because the centaurs were such excellent horsemen that each man and his mount seemed to be one animal. At the feast, these horsemen got drunk and tried to carry off the Lapith women. The Lapiths fought bravely for their ladies and won. Greek art never tired of this story, and perhaps used it to symbolize the clearing of the wilderness from wild beasts and the struggle between the human and the bestial in man. Note here how Durant theorizes a subconscious interpretation of centaur mythology. Just as we looked at the possibility of the Garden of Eden narrative representing the transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture during the Neolithic Revolution, again Durant is suggesting the same theme. This clearing of the wilderness from wild beasts is the Neolithic Revolution, just in Greek mythological form. Regardless, interpretations of the centaur are all in dualities. The centaur's role is to visually manifest underlying psychological divisions within human beings. The centaur is half man, half horse, and also half rational, half emotional, half domesticated, half wild, half sexually restrained, half libidinous. Theanthropic figures like this did not originate with the ancient Greeks. In fact, they take us back to where we started. There is some evidence that even some prehistoric cave paintings have images with a mixture of human and animal features. Greek legends and mythology started in an oral form, but the first written treatises we have in an extant form on the equine theme are The Art of Horsemanship and The Cavalry Commander by Xenophon. Xenophon's dates are approximately 430 to 354 BC. These two treatises are relatively short. You could read both of them in an afternoon. Let's take a look at them. The Art of Horsemanship begins with advice on buying horses. Xenophon tells us not to be too impressed with the horse's size or beauty, but first to look at its feet. He compares buying a horse with bad feet to buying a house with poor foundations. Wide nostrils, we are informed, help the horse to breathe deeply. He advises against buying a horse over the age of 5, and that you can tell the horse's age by looking at its teeth. We get advice on stables. For example, the floor of a stable should be slightly sloped so as to allow water to run off and prevent damp from damaging the horse's feet. The last time I visited a stables, this advice was still being applied some 2,400 years later. Xenophon talks about grooming, which parts of the horse should be groomed. He advises against cleaning the belly or barrel of the horse, for it irritates the animal and it only gets dirty again as soon as you take the horse out riding. He discusses the driving of horses. There's a big difference between riding and driving horses. During the heroic age of Greece, chariots were used very differently. If we are to take Homer at his word, then Achilles, for example, doesn't ride his horse. He drives his chariot to and from the battlefield, and then he gets out to fight on foot. This seems very odd to us since we're used to the idea of cavalry playing an important part in ancient war. It did, but probably later than you think. For example, at the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians had no significant cavalry units. Horses were, rather, the luxury of the rich. If we ask ourselves why this is the case, it's worth remembering that Greece was not well suited to horse racing. 80% of Greece is mountainous, and the plains below are few and far between. Cavalry became slightly more prominent during the classical period, hence the need for treatises like those of Xenophon's. However, it really wasn't until Philip and the Macedonians that cavalry came into its own in ancient Greece. Anyway, Xenophon continues on with his second treatise, the Cavalry Commander. Xenophon, a pious man, first entreats you, the cavalry commander, to pray to the gods. If you want to win, get right with the gods. Once the gods are on side, he then discusses tactics, as well as the importance of cavalry in reconnaissance, and then he talks about how you can learn to throw the javelin whilst on horseback. He also teaches how to judge distance by looking at two moving objects, and how to tell how far away men and horses are from each other, and how quickly one could overtake another. He also writes about the features of the horse, and the kind of armour that is going to be needed to protect the animal in battle. And then he talks about the qualities needed in a cavalry commander, sound judgment, and the importance of leading by example. This is so true in life. If you want to persuade somebody of something, usually the best way of doing this is by setting a good example. The biggest takeaway from the treatise, though, is the importance of treating the animal well. Of the horse, he says this: never deal with the animal when you are in a fit of passion, and always reward him for good behaviour. The treatises are still pretty useful to this day. For Xenophon, the best horses were Thessalian horses, and the best Thessalian horse of them all was, of course, Alexander the Great's great charger, Bucephalus. Bucephalus was not a young colt. He was already 14 and a large black charger. His name, Bucephalus, meant bull-headed. The story goes something like this. Philip II, Alexander's father, was given the horse as a gift, but no one at the Macedonian court could tame the animal, and so Philip wanted to get rid of the creature. Seeing this, Alexander, just a boy of 12 at this point, was so moved that he vowed to tame the animal. Studying the problem carefully, he noticed that Bucephalus seemed to fear his own shadow. Accordingly, Alexander took the reins and steered the animal towards the sun. Now, unable to see his shadow, the trust developed between the two of them. From this point on, Bucephalus was tamed, but he would only allow Alexander to ride him. Watching all of this, Philip is recorded as saying, "My son, Macedonia is too small for you. Seek out a larger empire, worthier of you." It's a good story, but you always wonder about stories of this kind. These kinds of stories always get tweaked to make them seem a little bit more prophetic. As the centuries went on, people adjusted the dates of birth so as to suggest that Bucephalus and Alexander were actually born on the same day. This is just to throw destiny into the mix. One thing is certain: when the horse died in 326 BC, Alexander was so devastated that he named the city of Bucephala in his honour. Bucephala as a city no longer exists. The exact timing and cause of that city's decline are still unknown. Durant tells us another story about this steed. He says this: Apelles, meanwhile, had captured the plaudits of the Greek world by painting his Aphrodite Anadyomene, i.e. Aphrodite rising from the sea. Alexander sent for him and sat for many portraits. The young conqueror was not satisfied with the representation of his horse, Bucephalus, in one of these pictures, and had the animal brought closer to the panel for comparison. Bucephalus, looking at the picture, whinnied, whereupon Apelles remarked, "Your Majesty's horse seems to know more about painting than you do." Unfortunately, the work of Apelles, as well as the vast majority of paintings from ancient Greece, have not survived. However, the most famous work of art that depicts both Alexander the Great and Bucephalus comes to us via the ruins at Pompeii. This mosaic, called the Battle of Isis, has been suggested by some people to be based on an earlier work of art by Apelles, although this remains uncertain. The mosaic itself is made up of some 1.5 million tiles. Its existence does give us some indication of just how much Alexander was revered in the Roman Empire. The mosaic depicts the first major battle between the League of Corinth under the Macedonians and the Achaemenid Empire. This was the first major battle where Darius III, or the King of Kings, and Alexander III, or Alexander the Great, were both present. When you look at this mosaic, what first catches your eye? I would say that it is the eyes themselves, all three sets: Alexander's determination, Darius's panic, and the terror in the eyes of Bucephalus. Of the mosaic, our author writes this: Persian cavalrymen rush up to rescue their ruler, and Alexander's weapon stays poised in the air. The representation of complex emotions in Darius's face is the outstanding accomplishment of the work, but the most attractive head in the composition is that of Alexander's horse. There is no greater mosaic than this. Moving on a bit from the Greeks to the Romans via Pompeii, if this is the greatest mosaic in history, well, probably the most well-known equestrian statue is that of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. What most tourists see is actually a replica. The original is preserved in the Capitoline museums. Over 4 meters tall, it dominates the piazza. Created in 175 AD, it's made out of gilded bronze. When it was first cast, the thin layer of gold would have shone brightly in the sun. This would have been quite a sight. If you look closely, you can still see some of the gold layer. You'll notice the calm expression on Aurelius' face. This is supposedly a representation of his Stoic philosophy. Well, possibly. Perhaps the purpose of this expression is more mundane. At this stage in Roman history, emperors were supposed to look regal. Aurelius is in fact far too big for his nag. Nevertheless, to my mind, it's actually the horse that steals the show. The one raised leg makes him seem playful. The legs give him a jaunty aspect that creates a sense of movement in the statue. It is to Michelangelo that we owe the statue's current state and location. He was charged by Pope Paul III with its restoration. It's one of the few bronze statues that have survived from antiquity. Its survival is interesting in itself. Historically, bronze has been considered valuable, and so most bronze statues from antiquity were, at one time or another, melted down. This particular statue survived because of its misidentification. For most of its history, the rider was identified as Constantine. It seems likely that early Christians were reluctant to melt down a statue of the emperor who had won the Battle of Milvian Bridge under the sign of the cross, and whose vision and conversion were so important to the history of Christianity. It does make you wonder just how much pagan art has been destroyed through the centuries. How many Roman emperors have we lost? Well, in this particular case, Christian confusion was very much to art's benefit. The horse's role in civilization is not limited to war, communications, and art. It also played a vital role in sport. Chariot racing, popular for centuries, reached its apogee in the West at the Circus Maximus, the largest stadium in ancient Rome. On race days, as many as 180,000 people would pour into the stadium. Vendors sold bread, pastries, fruits, nuts, grilled meats, beer, and wine. The wooden seating at the stadium was so uncomfortable that during all-day events, even cushions were sold. Musicians, jugglers, and acrobats performed outside the stadium to entertain the crowd. Gambling on the outcome of races was rife. People lost and won whole fortunes on the collision of a single chariot. The charioteers themselves were mostly slaves, owned by rival stables, each distinguished by colours, teams of white, green, red, or blue. As race days approached, the people of Rome talked about little else. The fans of each coloured faction spread across the city, and fights broke out between the supporters of one coloured team or another. The races themselves were of two-wheeled chariots drawn by either 2 or 4 horses, with usually 7 laps of the long, rectangle-shaped track that curved at the ends. In the middle of the track was an island called the Spina, 1,000 feet long, with 2 obelisks placed at the end of each side. These obelisks had been taken by the Romans after Augustus had made Egypt his personal property. To this day, Rome still has 13 obelisks. As the charioteers appeared before the race, supporters of each faction stood up in the stands and applauded. The great skill of the chariot races was taking the corners at speed, but without crashing into other chariots. Many charioteers died in these races, but spare a thought for the horses. Durant has a great section in the 3rd volume on chariot racing. I would recommend you read it, but I'm just going to give you a couple of lines of what he says. As the horses or chariots clattered to the final post, the hypnotized audience rose like a swelling sea, gesticulated, waved handkerchiefs, shouted and prayed, groaned and cursed, or exulted in almost supernatural ecstasy. The applause that greeted the winner could be heard far beyond the limits of the city. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, chariot racing largely stopped in the West, although it did continue on and in fact reached new heights in Byzantium. During the Middle Ages, the horse fell into the more mundane activity of farming, and Durant talks about this in the books. He says this: "Till the 11th century, the ox was the draft animal. He ate less expensively, and in old age could be eaten more profitably than the horse. But about 1000, the harness makers invented the stiff collar that would allow a horse to draw a load without choking. So dressed, the horse could plough 3 or 4 times as much in a day as the ox. In wet, temperate climates, speed of ploughing was important. So during the 11th century, the horse more and more replaced the ox, and lost his high status as reserve for travel, hunting, and war." As Durant says here, the crucial factor was the invention of the collar. The earlier yoke and breast strap harnesses were choking the horse, making it impossible to pull heavy weights. The horse collar, which was first invented in China and then spread to the rest of the world, had the great advantage in that it redistributed the load from the horse's neck to its shoulders and chest, allowing the horse to pull heavy loads while still being able to breathe. Horses are faster and have greater stamina than oxen, and can plough fields more efficiently. This led to greater crop yields and resulted in fewer people having to work on the land. This is one of the causes of the increased specialization among the workforce that took place during the medieval period. The collar wasn't the only equine invention of the Middle Ages. In antiquity, horses had no shoes. The widespread adoption of the nailed horseshoe emerged in medieval Europe between the 9th and 10th centuries. Another example of equine invention is stirrups. In Xenophon's treatises, he explains how horses can be trained to bend their knees or stretch out their legs so as to make them easier to mount. This was because during antiquity, stirrups were unknown. As with so much about horses, the stirrup was actually invented in China and spread to the rest of the world from there. The breeding of horses also developed to a much greater extent during this period. Horses that were bred for speed, called warm bloods, were for racing, whereas horses bred for stamina, called cold bloods, were draft horses. Variation in coat colours, in the form of solid colours or patterns, began to be selectively bred for. Today, there are hundreds of different breeds of horse. One of the consequences of hundreds of years of breeding is that today we have much larger horses. Incidentally, in the English-speaking world, horses' heights are often measured in hand units. The average horse in ancient Greece was significantly smaller than the ones that we have today. Some have wondered whether this can be seen on the Parthenon frieze. The horses there are smaller than they ought to be relative to the size of humans. This is, however, not to be taken as a sign that horses were smaller, but rather it's a stylistic choice of ancient Greek art. Any frieze involving multiple figures like this usually adopted isokolismos, the principle that symmetry and balance are important, and so the heads of all of these figures are of a similar height. Another thing to keep in mind about the Parthenon frieze is that it was intended to be seen from the ground. The angle that you look at something changes your perspective on it. Thus, Greek sculptures would exaggerate or accentuate certain aspects for effect. The horse's aesthetic qualities have been known to artists for thousands of years. If we trot along through the centuries, we can see another example of equine-related art, and I'll let Durant tell this tale. Meanwhile, 1483, Leonardo had undertaken a work completely different and still more difficult. Ludovico had long wished to commemorate his father, Francesco Sforza, with an equestrian statue that would bear comparison with Donatello's Gattamelata at Padua and Verrocchio's Colleoni in Venice. Leonardo's ambition was stirred. He set himself to studying the anatomy, action, and nature of the horse, and drew 100 sketches of the animal, nearly all of snorting vivacity. Soon he was absorbed in making a plaster model. When some citizens of Piacenza asked him to recommend an artist to design and cast bronze doors for their cathedral, he wrote characteristically in reply, "There is no one who is capable except Leonardo the Florentine, who is making the bronze horse of the Duke Francesco, and you need take no count of him. For he has work that will last his whole lifetime, and I fear that it is so great an undertaking that he will never finish it." Ludovico at times thought so too, and asked Lorenzo for other artists to come and complete the task, 1489. Lorenzo, like Leonardo, could not think of anybody better than Leonardo himself. At last, 1493, the plaster model was finished. All that remained was to cast it in bronze. In November, the model was set up publicly under an arch to adorn the wedding procession of Ludovico's niece, Bianca Maria. Men marvelled at its size and splendour. Horse and rider rose to 26 feet. Poets wrote sonnets in its praise, and no one doubted that when cast, it would surpass in power and life the masterpieces of Donatello and Verrocchio. But it was never cast. Apparently, Ludovico could not spare funds for the 50 tons of bronze required. The model was left in the open, while Leonardo busied himself with art and boys, with science and experiments, with mechanisms and manuscripts. When the French captured Milan, 1499, their bowmen made a target of the plasticavallo and broke off many pieces of it. Louis XII, in 1501, expressed a desire to cart it off to France as a trophy. We do not hear of it again. At about the same time that Leonardo was working on his horse in Milan, over in England, Richard III was still searching for his. Or so Shakespeare tells us. All the world knows the quote. Catesby. "Rescue, my lord of Norfolk, rescue, rescue! The king enacts more wonders than a man, daring and opposite to every danger. His horse is slain, and all on foot he fights, seeking for Richmond in the throat of death. Rescue, fair lord, or else the day is lost." Norfolk exits with soldiers. Enter Richard. Richard. A horse, my kingdom for a horse!" Catesby. "Withdraw, my lord. I'll help you to a horse." Richard. "Slave, I have set my life upon a cast, and will stand the hazard of the die. I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field. 5 have I slain today instead of him. A horse, my kingdom for a horse." Okay, I don't know if that's any good. Those are Richard III's last words in the play. He dies on Bosworth Field looking for both Richmond and his horse. That Richmond here is the Earl of Richmond, or Henry Tudor, the future King Henry VII of England. What always struck me about Richard's death here is how heroic Shakespeare makes him. Catesby urges him to withdraw, he refuses. He's determined to fight it out to the last. Durant suggests that Richard, his soldiers refusing to fight, died in a desperate charge. It's odd because Shakespeare wrote the play conscious of not wanting to displease the Tudor Tudor court. Richmond here is Elizabeth I's grandfather, and so Richard III has to be portrayed as the villain, regardless of what the historical reality may have been. But Richard goes out here showing no little courage. That is, unless you interpret his plea for a horse as an attempt for him to flee the battlefield. Regardless, his famous line has both a literal and ironic meaning. At that moment, the whole kingdom is worth no more than one horse. Incidentally, Richard's supporter here, Catesby, is William Catesby. He was the ancestor of Robert Catesby, who was the chief organizer of the Gunpowder Plot. Horses run, or should that be gallop, right the way through Shakespeare. In fact, they go right the way through literature. When I think about what made the biggest impact on my imagination, it was probably the writing of Jonathan Swift. In 1726, Jonathan Swift published his Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon, then a captain of several ships, or as we more simply call it today, Gulliver's Travels. Here we get one of the more famous descriptions of horses in literature in the guise of the Houyhnhnm, our author now comparing the Houyhnhnm to their human servants, the Yahoos. By contrast, the Houyhnhnm, being reasonable, are happy and virtuous. Therefore, they need no physicians, lawyers, clergymen, or generals. These gentlemanly horses are shocked by Gulliver's account of Europe's wars, and still more by the disputes that generated them, as whether flesh be bread or bread be flesh in the Eucharist, whether the juice of a certain berry be blood or wine. And they cut Gulliver short when he boasts of how many human beings could now be blown up by the marvellous inventions which his race has invented. After all his travels, Gulliver of course does return home, but after so long in the company of the Houyhnhnm, he can't stand the company of human beings, viewing them all as Yahoos. Lemuel, a great name, prefers to spend his days in the stable, chatting away to the ponies. The extent to which we're supposed to side with Gulliver in his disgust of humanity is unclear, as is the extent to which we're supposed to view the Yahoo-Houyhnhnm relationship as a satire on Anglo-Irish relations of the day. When we get to Swift in the books, which is in Volume 8, The Age of Louis XIV, then we'll consider the novel more closely. The point here is the question of why horses? Why not have the civilized Houyhnhnm be represented by dogs, deer, or dolphins, or even an animal not beginning with the letter D? To that question I would give 2 answers. First, horses already had some of the qualities that Swift wished to exalt. The grace and beauty of horses is supposed to match the Houyhnhnm's logical character. And second, the ubiquity of horses in 18th century life. Everybody in England would have had a day-to-day familiarity with horses. This is something that the vast majority of us have lost in the age of the internal combustion engine. By the time we get to Swift and the 18th century, there had been a revolution in travel. The invention of the horse collar allowed for carriages to be built that were able to take heavier loads at faster speeds. This in turn meant there were changes to braking and suspension systems. Here now is Durant talking about travel in the 18th century. Those who could afford it travelled on horseback or by private carriage. On long trips they could hire fresh horses at posts, i.e. positions, en route. There were such post houses all over Western Europe. The word post came to be applied to the transmission of mail because at such points the mail carriers could deliver or pick up mail and change horses. By this system they could cover 120 miles a day. Even so, Chesterfield complained, 1749, that our letters go, at best, so irregularly, and so often miscarry totally. He thought it uncommon diligence that a letter from Verona reached London in 8 days. Most travel was by stagecoach, drawn by 2 or 4 horses, with driver and armed guard on the outside, and 6 passengers swaying within. Coaches left London on a regular schedule, 2 or 3 mornings a week, for the major towns of South England. They averaged 7 miles an hour, and took 6 days between London and Newcastle. Chesterfield here is Lord Chesterfield. He's well known for the letters he sent to his son. Horses were important not only for travel, but they also had a role in ceremonial functions. This remains the case to this day. An example of this is the state opening of Parliament, at which a horse and carriage will carry the monarch, the crown, and the mace. One of the best historical examples of horses being used in a ceremonial function came in 1804 with the coronation of Napoleon. The horses were supposed to add grace and splendour to a spectacle that would awe the French public into deference and obedience. Durant writes about this. Meanwhile, from another point of the Tuileries, the imperial cavalcade proceeded. First, Marshal Marin, governor of Paris, and his staff. Then some specially designated regiments of the army. Then, in 6-horse carriages, the leading officers of the government. Then, a carriage for the Bonaparte brothers and sisters. Then, a royal coach marked with a blazoned N, drawn by 8 horses, and bearing the emperor in purple velvet embroidered with gems and gold, and the empress, at the peak of her precarious splendour, robed in silk and sparkling with jewellery, her face so well made up that though 41, she looked like 24. Present at the coronation was Jacques-Louis David. He was there to paint the scene, but we're more interested in his equestrian painting of Napoleon. Here's a suggestion from the emperor to David. For every historical picture you may choose to paint, you shall receive 100,000 francs. This was convincing. David sealed the pact with Bonaparte crossing the Alps, 1801, which showed a handsome warrior with a charming leg on a magnificent horse that appears to be galloping up a rocky mountainside, one of the most brilliant pictures of the age. If you look here now, you can see how Napoleon is pointing upwards. He's the leader that's going to take us to new and greater heights. Boney's going to the top. That's the idea. Also, you'll notice at the bottom that there are names carved in the rock. Charlemagne, Hannibal. Both of these, of course, famously travelled across the Alps themselves with differing levels of success. Napoleon has some similarities with both of these, and David is trying to imply that Napoleon is of similar historical significance as those two. The magnificent horse that is mentioned by Durant in David's painting is, of course, Marengo. Marengo is named after the French victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo that took place in northern Italy in Piedmont near Alessandria on the 14th of June 1800. The battle, of course, greatly strengthened Napoleon's political position in France. Marengo was of an Arabian breed and had been imported over from Egypt during Napoleon's campaign there. A grey-white thoroughbred, although on the smaller side, he was renowned for his speed and endurance, as well as his ability not to get skittish under fire. He survived the retreat from Moscow and was the horse that Napoleon rode at the Battle of Austerlitz and then again 10 years later at the Battle of Waterloo. He was captured by the British after Waterloo and transported over to England, where he lived for another 16 years, dying in 1831. Marengo's skeleton is in the National Army Museum in Chelsea, in West London, and a memento Marengo, a replica of his skeleton, is on display in Les Invalides, which is in the 7th arrondissement in Paris. Marengo, captured at Waterloo, had a natural counterpart at that battle, that being Wellington's horse, Copenhagen. He was named after the British victory at the Naval Battle of Copenhagen in 1807. He was of an Arabian breed, with a strong and fiery temperament, and a chestnut coat. Originally bred as a racehorse, he came into military service in 1812, and by 1813 he was transported to Portugal for use in the Peninsular War. After Waterloo, Copenhagen was retired from military service and lived on in Wellington's estate in Hampshire until he died in 1836. Both of these horses had a strong bond with their riders and have gone down, along with Bucephalus, as some of the most famous horses in history. The British victory at Waterloo has been commemorated in place names. If you travel around Britain, it won't take you long to find places that are named after either Napoleonic historical figures or Napoleonic battles. It's either that or Victoria and Albert. Wellington and Copenhagen, though, have been commemorated in statuary. In 1846, a giant statue of Wellington riding on Copenhagen was unveiled to sit on top of Wellington's arch in Hyde Park Corner. The statue is made out of bronze melted down from French cannons that were captured at the Battle of Waterloo. The statue is huge, over 9 meters high. It's so large, in fact, that a rider on horseback can ride under the belly of Copenhagen without banging his head. Cast years after Copenhagen's death, it's generally considered to be a poor likeness. At the time of its unveiling and placement on top of the arch, the statue was loved and cheered by the public, but it was generally disliked by most of the sculptors, artists, architects, and MPs of the time. Even the Queen herself is said to have disliked it. Considered tastelessly large and not properly aligned with the arch, it was in fact placed sideways. However, nobody wanted to offend the Duke, who was still very much alive at this point, and so the statue stayed up there for years. It wasn't until 1885 that the statue was moved to Aldershot, a town considered more appropriate given that it's known as the home of the British Army. You can still find the statue there today. We could continue on to look at horses all the way up to the 21st century, but Durant stops with the Napoleonic period, and so will we. It's actually a good place to stop because not long after sees the coming of the railways. For 5,000 years, travel by horse was as fast as you could go, but by 1829, Stephenson's rocket, running in the Rainhill trials, could travel at the dizzying speed of 48 kilometers an hour, 30 miles. This is about as fast as a horse with a rider at full gallop can go. But unlike the horse, the locomotive doesn't tire. The technological wonder of the steam locomotive signalled the decline in the use of the horse. True as that was, it's worth remembering that from its first appearance millions of years ago through to its domestication, as well as its use in trade, transport, war, mosaic, sculpture, painting, its influence on literature, as well as its sheer beauty, the horse has been the most influential animal in the history of civilization. Well, that was Durant's writing on horses. Given that there are over 700 references right the way through the series, obviously I couldn't mention them all, but there are some nice bits and pieces for you. The next video in this volume will be focused on the foundations of industry, which will focus on fire in human prehistory. But I also intend to start making videos for volume 2, the preface, as well as the next section, which is on the geography of the Aegean. So I hope you'll watch those videos, and I hope you enjoyed this one. And yeah, have a great day, whatever it is you're doing, and I'll see you later.